Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I've never been a big one for making New Year's resolutions. It always just seemed to me like I was setting myself up for failure. On January 1st, I'd be full of confident resolve, and then a month or two later, I'd find myself pretty much in the same situation I was on December 31st, only with an added layer of guilt and shame. However, this year I changed all that. This year I decided to make a resolution I knew I would keep. This year I resolved to make more mistakes. I figured, how can I go wrong with that one? Okay, maybe not make more mistakes on purpose, but to take more risks. To lose my fear of making mistakes. To stop playing it so safe all the time and, by necessity, of course, get used to failing a lot. So wish me luck. Now, you might wonder why I bring that up this morning. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that Lent is a really good time to make friends with failure, because Lent is really all about failure. It's a 6-week reminder that we human beings are hardwired to get it wrong most of the time. Lent is about facing our limits, spiritually, emotionally, and even physically. For Lent also reminds us that we have a very short window on this earth in which to make all of our mistakes. We are mortal. We have an expiration date. When we received our ashes on Wednesday night, we remembered that. And we also faced up to that shadow side, that mistake-prone side, the one that harbors all of our fears and our guilt and our shame and our anger, the side we don't like to look at. Lent is a really great time for doing that. And the second reason I mentioned my Make More Mistakes resolution is that I expect to be making a whole bunch over these next 6 weeks. As you may know, during this Lenten season, we will be engaging in a conversation about something many of us are familiar with, some of us intimately, very few of us admit, and most of us don't understand. We're going to be talking about addiction. And I'm really rather nervous about this. We are going to be exploring the Lenten journey of surrender and accountability and recovery through the lens of the 12 steps, the core spiritual tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous. And to be fully transparent, I have never been through a 12-step program. I have not had the kinds of experiences with addiction that take us to those very dark, those very raw places that are witnessed to at every AA meeting. And I'm concerned that in my ignorance, I may put my foot in my mouth a lot. And so I am asking for your preemptive forgiveness when I do. Even with my heart in the right place, I know I will make some mistakes with this. But I also know that just because I am not in AA, I am no stranger to addiction. None of us are. The reality of the human condition is that we are all addicted to something. The inspiration for this series came from that realization. In my work here as a pastor, I'm often let in on people's struggles with addiction, both visible and invisible, and I've seen the pain and devastation that it's caused. Now, some addictions are relatively easy to see, like alcoholism and drug abuse. It's hard to hide their corrosive effects for very long. And then there are some addictions that are less obvious, those that unravel us from the inside long before they are obvious on the outside, like gambling, or pornography, or shopping, or sex, or food, or debt. But addictions can go well beyond those behaviors that land us in a prescribed 12-step program. Some of us are addicted to things that we would never recognize as a problem, like relationships, or work, or praise, or even success. Pastor Nadia Boltz-Weber, a recovering addict herself, whose tattoos and fondness for leather biker gear brands her as a very different kind of Lutheran minister, Nadia reminds us of the insidious nature of our culture's love affair with addiction. We live in a worthiness-driven culture, she says. The pressure to be successful, to hide your weakness, to get ahead and to make your own way in the world, to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, to win at all costs, and to be as impressive as possible to as many people as possible. This is what drives our entire cultural and economic system. And I agree with her. And I think that our greatest challenge is that we don't even see this worthiness-driven culture as a problem. We don't recognize that it is the root of so many of our addictions. Instead, we embrace it as a badge of enlightenment and independence. We have no idea how corrosive it is until exhausted and warped by never ever feeling truly worthy, we find ourselves unraveling from the inside, unable to knit ourselves back together. But oh, how we try. With resolutions and self-talk and self-help programs and anything that tells us how we can solve our problems through our willpower and our Protestant work ethic. But as Albert Einstein said, a problem cannot be solved by the same mind that created it. And that is never more true than when it comes to addiction, which can feel like such a betrayal to us. For we believe that we should be able to fix ourselves. If we got ourselves into this mess, we should be able to get ourselves out. Because addictions, after all, often begin with good impulses. They arrive out of our primal need to feel at home with ourselves, to mend our broken places. When we are in pain, we seek to feel better. That is an essential human survival response. The danger arises when our addictive behavior becomes a replacement for authentic healing. It almost always leaves us more wounded, more distant from ourselves, isolated in a kind of spiritual solitary confinement of our own making. Finding our way back to ourselves can feel impossible. About 25 years ago, Father Richard Rohr, Franciscan priest, was asked to give a series of talks linking the wisdom of the 12 steps and what he calls the marrow of the gospel. He saw them intersecting in the experience of transformation, what 12-step folks know as recovery, and Christians often call salvation. The result was a book called Breathing Underwater. Seeing that we are not only awash in addictions as people and as a culture, but at real risk of drowning, he sought to help us see that there are breathing lessons available in both the gospel and the guidance of the 12 steps. So for this next season, we're going to put those two sources of wisdom in conversation together. And we're going to begin that conversation this morning with the story of Jesus' 40-day wilderness wandering and the first 3 of the 12 steps. The ones where we admit that we are powerless over our addictions, that we believe there is a power greater than ourselves that can help us, and that we are ready to surrender to that power, which of course can make many of us wildly uncomfortable. Why? Because these first 3 steps are all about letting go, all about relinquishing control. And lack of control is perhaps what we believe got us into this mess to begin with, right? And so we hold on even tighter. But more control is not the prescription that can heal us. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Which brings us to our gospel story this morning, which Dan just shared for us. As Mark tells it, Jesus has barely toweled off from his baptism before he finds himself driven into the wilderness by the Spirit, alone for 40 days. I wonder what was going through Jesus' mind at that moment. I mean, just a minute before, he's standing in the Jordan River, surrounded by crowds and hearing God call him, "My beloved, with whom God is well pleased." And the next moment, he is literally nowhere, surrounded by a big empty. Now, what Mark doesn't tell us is that Jesus isn't totally alone in that desert. Satan shows up, and he has lots of ideas about how to get Jesus to doubt that he is actually God's beloved, to doubt that he is worthy of that name. Now, Mark doesn't give us any of those details in his version of the gospel, but Matthew does. In Matthew's version, Satan tempts Jesus with promises of security and food and power. In essence, he is offering Jesus control over all the fears that we human beings have. Fear that we aren't really safe, that we will go hungry, that we are powerless. And each time Satan offers these things to Jesus, he is trying to undermine Jesus' identity as God's beloved. He says, if you are the Son of God, then make these things happen. He taps into Jesus' greatest fear of all. He second guesses that Jesus is worthy. In many ways, those underlying fears are what leave us so vulnerable to the power of addiction. Of course, they don't really seem like fears to us at the time. They seem like reasons. And that's the way Satan plays them too. He's the king of justification, of the easy excuse. He's also the voice that tells us that on our own, simply as God's beloved child, we are never going to be good enough. We need this drink, this promotion, these shoes, this relationship, this thrill. I think another great word for Satan, one that we might resonate a bit more with, is ego. It is the ego that puts our own security, wants, and needs above all. It is the ego that tells us that we can achieve success for ourselves by ourselves. It is our ego that spawns the shelves and shelves of self-help books, which tell us that only if we try harder can we lick whatever it is that frightens us. It is our ego that tells us we can't really trust God. We've got this covered, it whispers to us. Just you and me. And it is our ego that needs to get out of the way if we are ever going to break the power of our addictions. Richard Rohr says that the 12 steps are so spiritually powerful precisely because they aren't a self-help program. They are based on the idea that our human will is most often the problem and not the solution. That we can break the tyranny of addiction, we cannot break the tyranny of addiction with more addictive thinking. Because let's face it, our addictions are not really a problem of the will. They are a problem of the soul. They are what happens when we put something other than God at the center of our lives. And I don't mean religion. I mean God. Religion can be just as destructive and addictive a force as anything else. No, the only way to free ourselves is to center ourselves on a force of love that is bigger than our fears. You can call it whatever you like. For 12 steps, folks, that force is known as a higher power. You and I may know her as her nickname, God. And for us Christians, it is this God that makes himself known through that hero of downward mobility, the man from Nazareth. The subversive gospel of Jesus turns our worthiness culture upside down. It tells us that only through vulnerability, only through failure, can we let go of our ego's illusions that we can find true wholeness, true recovery, true salvation, to use that loaded Christian word. It is only when we let go of the idea that it's all up to us that we can begin to take the first steps out of the darkness. It's only then that we realize we have some company leading us through the emptiness. It's only then that we can look up and see that the angels, as Mark calls them, the presence of God, has been in the wilderness with us all the time. Mark's version of the story is the only one that tells us that. Luke's version never even mentions the angels, and Matthew has them swooping in right at the end. But for Mark, the angels are there all the time. They are part of the Spirit that drives Jesus into the emptiness, and they are there to hold him when it is all over. One of the most powerful lessons that those 40 days taught Jesus is that he is never alone in his struggles. He will always have God's presence with him. but he had to risk losing everything in order to get there. And so do we. That number 40 is symbolic in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it echoes the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in their own desert wilderness. And it is the number of days in our season of Lent. For the ancient Hebrews, the number 40 represents the span of a human life, the transformation of our consciousness from birth to death. And so we have come to know that the surrender of faith, the journey of transformation, can take a lifetime as well. It's a long and winding journey, a slow and gradual releasing of what we thought we knew, and often painful letting go of old habits on our path to recovery. But who would think that breaking bad patterns would be so hard? But what the ego hates more than anything is change. And as creatures that cling to the ego's false promises like grim death, surrender is the most frightening change of all. But the surrender is the only way that we can begin. And that is why at the end of each AA meeting, the community shares the serenity prayer together. You may be very familiar with this. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It is a reminder that true wisdom is found in knowing how to let go of what we need to. And so as we, as this community, move into our time of prayer, we will take this first step of release together. And we will dare to offer up to our higher power the most honest words in the human language. I can't do this alone. I need you. Whatever holds you bound on this morning, whatever addiction you identify, the limits of fullness of life for you, hand it over to God. Lay down your fixations, your fears, your judgments, your compulsions. Lay down all the burdens that you carry within you, the ones you've been trying to figure out for yourself for years. Just take a moment and breathe and rest. You are not in charge, and you are not supposed to be. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Failure is not the end. It is the beginning. And more than anything, know this. In all of it, the questions, the doubts, the struggles, the darkness, you are not alone. The angels have been with you all the time. God waits only for us to open a space within our hearts and our minds to hear and believe that. So let's make that room. Let's find that space. Let's welcome God's presence now in a moment of deep silence, that we might truly hear this word whispered into our hearts.